Welcome back to Senior MMPT. For those joining us for the first time, Senior MMPT is a monthly series organized by the Master Program in Higher Education Management, the Graduate School Universitas Gadjah Mada. Through this platform, we bring together leading scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to discuss challenges and opportunities, and also the ideas shaping the future of higher education, research, and public policy. Today, we are so delighted and honored to be joined by Professor Farish Noor, a distinguished scholar, historian, and political scientist whose work on this area is widely respected across academic communities. Having spent nearly 2/3 of his life in Europe and taught at reputable universities across the continent and also in Southeast Asia, Professor Farish Noor brings a truly global perspective to today's conversation on the ecosystem of higher education. Professor Farish Noor, welcome to Senior MMPT. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here too. Thank you.
Our first question, it is about the current ecosystem of higher education. Maybe you could start it with the global, regional, and national landscape of higher education.
Well, I think when we look at the state of higher education, universities in particular, what I have seen over the last few decades is how universities all over the world, not only in Southeast Asia, our region, but also in Europe and North America and Australia, are facing very similar pressures and seem to be moving in a similar direction as a result of increasing demands upon universities to perform according to a standard that is somehow set by the private sector in particular, the needs of industry. And I think this comes at a time when a certain hegemonic neoliberal logic has crept into academia, where universities are increasingly expected to perform certain tasks or provide certain services that meet, above all, the needs of industry rather than society. And I think a lot of the pressure faced by universities here in Southeast Asia are actually very similar to what I've seen in Europe, particularly in Germany, Holland, France, and England as well. So I think this has become a global phenomenon. So if you're going to understand what's happening to universities in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, I think we need to take a broader perspective and look at what's happening to universities worldwide.
Right. Particularly, you have observed the development of higher education in, let's say, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, and also perhaps in Vietnam. What do you see as the defining strength and key challenges of its system in those 4 countries?
Well, let's go back and understand how and why universities came about in the first place. The university as we know it today is a relatively modern institution. There are universities that claim to have long histories. In Europe, for instance, you have well-known universities like Oxford and Cambridge. But if you go back hundreds of years in the past, these universities, at one point, centuries ago, were performing functions that are very different from what we see today. In the past, a lot of the universities in the Western world, in Western Europe, were basically centers of philosophy and theology. So you go to university to study revealed knowledge, you study theology, you study philosophy, but they did not perform the different tasks that they're expected to do today. The university is, as we know it now, the universities that we work in came quite late in our history. Now, when we look at Southeast Asia in particular, there has been a long tradition of education, long before the modern university. And one thing that we cannot deny, whether we like it or not, is that the university in the post-colonial setting is part of the legacy of colonialism, right? I mean, we developed universities in the 40s and 50s when our countries in Southeast Asia became independent. And even then, there was an implicit understanding that in order to appear modern, to appear to have the appearance of a modern sovereign nation state, there were certain things that were required, and this included, of course, governments, constitutions, legislatures, but also universities. So you have to appear like a modern country with a modern university. So the university has always had an instrumental role in our society. Now, historically, of course, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the logic of the university, the way in which universities were run, both in the West and in the East, was somewhat different, because there was also the belief that education was something that all citizens were entitled to. A good example would be the development of public universities in the United Kingdom after World War II. After World War II, during that transition period from the late 40s to the 50s to the 60s, there was this belief that universities should not be elite institutions, that every citizen has the right for education. And so this witnessed the creation of many universities, public universities, what we call red brick universities, that suddenly made education a right for all citizens and not the privilege of a minority of elites. Education for all. And if you look at our own history, the history of Indonesia, this is actually one of the founding principles of the formation of the Indonesian Republic, that the new republic would be a democracy where all Indonesian citizens have a right and entitlement to education. Now, that culture where education should serve the needs of society as a whole, I think that has slowly changed, particularly from the 80s onwards, when universities came under the management, a different kind of management, when universities were then seen as institutions that had to fund themselves and had to make profit. And so this commercialization of education began more or less at the same time in the East and in the West.
Related to that, talking about policy, competition and collaboration. As you said, universities today are expected to compete globally while also serving national development goals. What do you take on this?
Well, this is where I think those of us who are in academia may have a different viewpoint. Let's dissect this a bit. The mantra that is repeated again and again today, both in the developed world and the developing world, North and South, East and West, is that universities should serve the needs of industry. I'm not comfortable with this idea, not because I'm against it. I don't think there's any problem with universities serving the needs of industry. But there seems to have occurred a kind of differentiation where industry is somehow seen as separate from society. Industry is society. Society creates and sustains industry. Now, in the 40s, 50s and 60s, serving the needs of society and serving the needs of industry were the one and the same thing. You create an educated public. We need an educated public. And an educated public would also benefit industry. Today, however, the needs of industry seem to be more dominant. And that's because of, again, the commercialization of education, where particularly as a university student in England in the 80s, during the time of Margaret Thatcher, we began to see how certain sectors of the industry would increasingly make demands upon the state. We want more of this, we want more workers, we want more technicians, we want more engineers. And universities are expected to somehow provide services. So in that sense, this is when the commodification of education happens. It begins then. And as a result of that, we now have this situation where the needs of industry and the needs of society are seen as divergent, as different. And I would argue that, for us in Southeast Asia, the needs of our society are just as important as the needs of industry. Because we have to remember that our countries are young. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, we are relatively young countries. And it's often said that Southeast Asia is a region of 600 million people plus. However, we know for a fact that in terms of mass education and public literacy, economic literacy, political literacy, historical literacy, we are still lagging behind. So I believe that my task as an educator is to play a public role. And I don't serve industry. I'm not paid by industry. I serve my students who are members of society. Now, that divergence has happened partly because many states in Southeast Asia are basically guided by a certain developmental model which we inherited from colonialism, where we have to develop in a particular way. So this is capital driven development, and when so much emphasis is placed on just capital driven development, other kinds of development, societal development, development of public consciousness, public awareness, public literacy in economics, politics and what have you, that wanes as a result. And I think that in the long run will incur a cost on our societies. So I cannot say that I'm fully in favor of this industry driven approach to education, because industry, like I said, is part of society. Society sustains industry, not the other way around.
Thank you, Prof. Farish. Now it's about research, innovation, and academic culture. Research excellence has become a key indicator of university performance. In your view, what factors have enabled some universities in the region to build stronger research ecosystem, and what lessons can other institutions learn from their experience?
Well, first of all, I think to go back to your earlier question, and can link the two questions together, I think there is the task of the university. I mean, what is a university? Yeah? If you're talking about education and learning, we can learn anywhere. You don't have to learn in a university. You can learn anywhere. You can learn at the bus stop. You can learn, at home. And so the purpose of the university is to create, I think, a space where original critical thinking can actually take place. And I think that is, in the long run, important, not only for individuals, but for the sake of society as a whole. An aware public, a public that is politically literate, economically literate, is an educated public, and an educated public, we hope, will create an environment where proper equitable governance can actually take place. Now, when it comes to research, then again the prerogatives for research again seem to be driven so much by industrial needs at the moment, and this mindset of competition, that competition is meant to be good. Competition might be good in the business sector, but if you apply that to academic life, it raises the question, is academia a business sector, and are we meant to compete? As you mentioned earlier, I've had a career that has taken me across the globe, from Europe to Southeast Asia. And I've spent an equal amount of time working and teaching both in the West and in the East. I consider myself an academic as a member of the academic community, as the global academic community. So are you. Yeah, we are all part of that community. This is the first thing that I tell to my students. The moment you become an academic, you belong to an international family. We are all academics working together. Now, this prerogative to compete, basically undermines this other prerogative, which is perhaps a more ethical prerogative of cooperation and mutual support, that we learn together, we work together. I'm a historian, so I belong to the fraternity of historians. We don't, try to undermine one another. We all of us realize that we are contributing to the wider body of historical knowledge, and all of us have a role to play. But when you bring in that logic of competition, then suddenly universities become like football clubs. And we have to compete, we have to beat each other. And this I find very unhealthy. It's unhealthy because, one, it breaks down the bonds of solidarity between academics, between disciplines. So historians don't want to work with political scientists don't want to work with sociologists, because everyone claims, we are the only ones who know the truth, whatever that is. And I think that's already detrimental to actual scholarship, because a true scientist, social scientist or hard scientist, needs to be cognizant of the fact that we are all working together to build knowledge for humanity. So that spirit of humanism gets undermined by a competitive market logic where I have to be better than you. And I've never believed in that, and I don't subscribe to that. And I've tried to work in institutions that are more geared towards collaboration and cooperation rather than competition. But then this brings us into this other very alien world of rankings. Rankings. And the rankings are not only for universities, they're also for faculties, for departments, and even for individuals. I'm perhaps thankful of the fact that I'm going to retire soon, so that I don't have to waste my time on this sort of nonsense. But with my experience, I've been in academia for more than 3.5 decades now, and all of this is very new. Yeah, again, in the history of higher education. When I began as an academic, we didn't have any of this. We didn't have these rankings and departments competing with one another. This culture of rankings, and we rank everything: universities, departments, faculties, disciplines, and individual academics. Has work rankings with KPIs, right? I mean, this has basically created an increasingly competitive, but also increasingly toxic environment, where I think that spirit of collaboration and cooperation, that fraternity between academics and society, has become eroded. And also, when you think about it, like I said, this is all very new. Let me give you an example. If we were to look at a discipline that we are familiar with now, like political theory, political science, famous works would be, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, John Locke, an essay on human understanding, or treatise on governance. Or if you look at our region, Bukhara al-Jahari, it's an incredibly important work, the Tash'us Salatin. Now, you can't go back to Bukhara al-Jahari in the 17th century and say, what's the economic benefit of writing the Tash'us Salatin? You can't go to Hobbes and say, what's the economic benefit of writing the Leviathan? You can't go back to Plato or Socrates and ask, what's the benefit of the Socratic method? What's the economic benefit? How do we rank them? I mean, that would be absurd. Now, if we recognize the absurdity of doing that, why do we do it now? And I think this is where I think a lot of academics like myself, particularly those who are rather late in their professions, have grown increasingly worried and concerned about where universities are heading. Because I'm an academic, I'm not a footballer. I didn't join a football team, and I cannot comprehend why so many universities.
Before that, can I ask one prior question? We will ask you about your suggestions for future higher education, but before that, it's about AI. So the future of universities in the AI era.
Right. Okay.
Artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and changing labor markets are transforming higher education worldwide. How should university in Southeast Asia rethink teaching, learning, curriculum design, and the graduate preparations in response to these changes?
Well, universities today are compelled to redesign themselves, reorient themselves according to every new technology that comes, right?
Exactly.
So after AI, there might be something else, and again, we have to change. Again, so many people talk about AI without actually asking how it came about and what the origins of AI are. You have to remember that in the 80s, AI is not new, by the way. It goes back to the 80s, 70s and 80s. And at the beginning, one of the reasons that people began to build these systems was to address a philosophical question: what is thought? What is thought? You and I are having an experience now. What is experience? This is a deep philosophical question, And AI was a tool to try to understand what is thinking, what is cognition, what is it to have an experience. Now, from there, from the 70s and 80s, AI has been developed mainly by industry to do other things, and it works through algorithms. Right. I mean, we still don't know whether AI actually thinks. So that's why I'm not comfortable with the word artificial intelligence. I'm not sure whether there is an intelligence there, right? So this technology we have embraced, governments have embraced, because it has been sold to them as the future. This is what the future looks like. And we know who's doing this. It's basically powerful capital interests. These are oligarchs who basically are selling systems that are used not only to create information systems, but also other things which can be more sinister, like surveillance systems, systems of public control, management, and what have you. So now when universities are told, what do you do? How do you adapt to this? Of course, again, it brings us down to the basics of what a university is. What is a university? Why should anyone go to a university? Millions of people have never been to universities. Yeah, they're not suffering. It's perfectly all right not to go to university. You don't die if you don't go to university. So why would anyone go to a university? You go to university because the university is meant to provide a space where thought can actually happen, where we can think critically and we can learn things. But once tools are brought in to augment that process and perhaps shape and determine that process, then I wonder whether universities are actually still doing what they're meant to do.
Looking at that reflexive reference, so looking ahead, if you are advising higher education leaders and policymakers in Southeast Asia today, what would be your top 3 priorities to building a more resilient, inclusive, and globally respected higher education ecosystem over the next decade?
Well, when you talk about globally resilient system, again, what is the objective of having universities? I perhaps belong to an older generation where education was seen as a right and an entitlement of anyone. And that's because I come from the post-war generation where there was the belief that these old elite structures, have to be reconstructed. Remember, universities 200 years ago were very elite institutions. Poor people couldn't go to universities, women couldn't go to universities. It was largely a gendered elite space. So the idea of modern public education is important, and I hold the belief that this is what universities still ought to be. But when universities just become places that produced people who are skilled rather than knowledgeable, people who can perform tasks rather than can think critically, then basically we've turned universities into factories. And they're basically factories that are intended to produce skilled labor for certain industries that require skilled labor. Now, here's where we have a real dilemma, because AI is actually rendering a lot of these skills redundant. For instance, now certain professions are on the verge of decline. You don't need accountants anymore because AI can do that. A computer can do that for you. And so what do we teach? How do we teach? And I think above all, I'm not against technology, because remember, even writing is technology, even the laptop is technology. The pen you're holding, that's technology. It would be absurd to reject technology for the sake of rejecting technology. But who serves who? Does technology serve humanity, or is humanity there to serve technology? And I think this is the key question that all of us, society as a whole, needs to have. So to go back to your question, if you want to have a suggestion, why ask me? Ask society. Society will bear the brunt. The younger generation, Gen Z or Gen Alpha, will bear the brunt, and they are not brought into the discussion. Yeah, an entire generation of young people now, university students, are anxious, and every year my students become more anxious. Because I get older, my students always say the same, in their 20s. Yeah, so I've witnessed this over the last few decades. Every year my students become more anxious about the future because they can see the future changing before their very eyes. The Generation Z and Generation Alpha are very much aware of the fact that they are not going to have the same life as their parents. They are worried about real things like, can I ever get a job? Can I ever buy a house? Now, why is it that the younger generation are not brought into the discussion? Yeah, it's very rare to see these members of society, and they are members of society, brought into the discussion when states talk about technology. So I believe that if you're going to have a debate, have a proper debate, have an inclusive debate, like you said. How do you make universities inclusive? Well, talk to the students, for heaven's sakes. Talk to the younger generation, talk to the future students, and we need to decide as a society, what we want universities to do. Now, if we do not do this and universities go down the same path, eventually, this is the sort of nightmare scenario that many senior academics feel will happen. I think universities will devolve to become nothing more than factories producing skilled workers. Now, if you want to do, skilled work, you don't have to go to university. You can go to a vocational college, or you can learn how to code and do IT work online. You don't have to go to university. The university is in danger of becoming redundant because of this. And I think it's a dangerous thing when academics like us do not get into the debate and try to ask the questions we should be asking. Why are we doing this? What's going to be the impact? And are there ways that we can mitigate the negative outcomes that we can see are already happening now?
Professor Farish Noor, thank you very much for your thoughtful perspectives and also your wealth of experience sharing with us today. Your insights remind us that universities are more than institutions of learning. They are places where ideas are challenged, knowledge is created and produced, and future generations are prepared to contribute meaningfully to our society. As Southeast Asia navigates rapid technological change, shifting economic demands, and increasing global competition, the role of higher education has never been more important. As you said, we hope today's discussion has provided valuable perspectives for university leaders, policymakers, and researchers, educators, and also students across the region. And dear viewers, thank you for joining us on this episode of Senior MMPT. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow our series for more discussions with distinguished scholars and leaders on the present and future of higher education and public policy and also students. We value your feedback. We'd be delighted to hear your ideas if you have suggestions for future topics and guests. Until next time, thank you for listening and goodbye.